Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Cat's Track. Thank you for subscribing, liking, and sharing this with your friends. Today's episode is with our friend James Kitchen. James was born in Fredericton, New Brunswick. He tells me that his amazing wife is the steel in his spine. Wow, powerful, James. They also have two wonderful children and love their time together. Besides his loved ones, James is passionate about truth and the free society. And I'm extremely grateful for him and his service. Friends, you'll find his full bio attached. And James, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you're here. I'm very much looking forward to your answers to some of our questions. Are you ready now?
I am.
Excellent. Why do you do what you're doing?
Well, I've been a person with a lot of ideals and values and beliefs, probably ever since I was a young teenager. And I initially wanted to be a philosopher. When I went to college, I was a kid in the candy store when I learned about Aristotle and Plato, and so I was steering that way. Loved history and philosophy. Studied it in undergrad. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Loved the idea of being an egghead. And then, but at the last minute, I decided to go into law as the second best, because I thought arguing in debate class wasn't good enough. I wanted to argue in court as well. So, obviously, if you're like me and you like heady stuff, well, you're probably not going to go into corporate law. You're going to go into criminal or constitutional. So naturally, I steered towards that immediately in law school. And I have deep held beliefs about absolute truth and about people being free, people being able to manifest their dignity and live free lives and flourish as free people, and be free to pursue truth. Those things are really important to me. And so those are the things that drive me, because a lot of what I do is about getting at the truth, and it's about protecting people's freedoms, and it's about creating or maintaining or defending a society in which people actually are free. They're free to pursue truth. They're free to speak what they think is the truth. They're free to argue that there is a truth. They're free to argue that they have the truth and the government doesn't have it. They're free to live their lives according to what they think the truth is. And thereby be actually happy in the true sense of the word. And all those things matter to me. I actually care about humanity. I can't help myself. So that's why I do what I do.
Wow, what a great answer. I'm surprised you and I haven't met before. I don't know if you saw that I'm a huge human rights activist, and I'm constantly fighting for the underdog. And I'm really glad to know you now, because maybe there's other fights that we can fight together.
Yeah, there's lots of fights these days.
Isn't there? Oh my goodness, especially right now, February 4th, 2021. What about your top three things, James?
I give a lot of talks to people, and I often say a lot of things that surprise people. And, there is a lot of information that I think people don't have and they need to have, or a lot of questions I think they should be asking that aren't even on their radar. I mean, I guess the first thing I always tell people is you need to be more democratically or politically engaged. I hear from some people that, well, I don't join political parties, and I don't do that, and I don't even vote. It doesn't matter. Well, I mean, with all due respect, that's a pretty pathetic response. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're at the situation now that we're at, right? If that's your attitude, then we're all suffering because of it. And I encourage you to take a month and go live in a totalitarian, brutal regime where you don't have the ability to do that, and see what it's like. When I tell people that they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, they've been around for a while, I say, have you ever joined a political party? Why don't you join one? I mean, it hadn't even occurred to them, right? But I mean, there are likely to be a political party, small or big, that's going to represent your position. If you're opposed to lockdowns, if you actually want a free society, if you're opposed to an authoritarian communist takeover, there's probably a political party that represents that perspective that you can join. join them, right? But more specifically, I think it's valuable and important to do things like go to peaceful rallies, to write your MLA, your MP, to donate to the political party if you have the means, but also follow and engage with the third party advocacy groups is what I call them. But that's, but by that what I mean is for example, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You don't want to pay more taxes? Well, that's what they advocate for. Why don't you get their newsletter and send them a few bucks a month, right? The Justice Center advocates for your ability to be a free person. These are things that people can do that aren't really difficult, aren't really time consuming, that they can do to be democratically, politically engaged, right? Maybe actually pay a little bit of attention to what happens at the legislature, right? I know it's complicated, but it matters. I mean, it's people that are uninformed are people that's easy to control. And we're seeing that right now, right? I mean, the Canadian population is woefully ignorant of how politics and law work. But both on the sort of nasty side of politics, and then more on the more neutral side of just how is a bill passed? How do we get these? I mean, I always constantly get the questions for you. How did we get here? How did this happen? How did they do this? Can they do this? How can they do this? Well, I mean, really, you would have learned that in grade 12 if you were paying attention, right? And if you didn't, you need to learn it now, right? Because I mean, you don't need to pay a lawyer $300 an hour to teach you. I mean, you can, if you just sit down and put in the time and effort, you can learn this stuff, and you need to. And we're seeing now the price we all have to pay when so few of us do that, right? It's like, well, do I really need to do that? What's the benefit of it? Well, I mean, you're not just gonna naturally stay free. Freedom is the exception, right? Think of this, the second law of thermodynamics is that everything sort of just tends out to go to chaos, right? Well, that's how planet Earth, humans on Earth work. It always, the default is authoritarian, brutal regimes where people aren't free, right? That's the default now for the 7 and whatever billion people live on the planet. The majority of them are not free. Now that was prior to the lockdown. Now pretty much nobody is, but very few live in any kind of free society at all, right? And if you look at history, very few ever lived in a free society. So we used to live prior to the lockdowns in the exception. If we're going to maintain that, we're going to have to understand it and assert it and actively defend it, or we're gonna lose it. It's not going to naturally stay in place. The natural default situation is slavery, not freedom. So that's my number 1 point. I think my number 2 point is people need to think for themselves. They need to stop watching and reading, but especially watching the mainstream media. They the talk amongst all the people who are awake is, the mainstream media is awful, right? Which, they are, right? Then, it's not a pursuit for truth. It's the pushing of an agenda, right? Maybe it was decades ago. It's not anymore. And that's if it ever was. So, I mean, the regular people who are, trying to figure things out, I tell you, they got to turn off the TV, and you got to think for yourself, and you got to read for yourself. You have the ability to do it. Nobody needs to think for you, right? You can think for yourself. And then I think, well, I guess the thing that goes along with that is don't self-censor. Stop caring so much what people think. Stop being so scared of the consequences of speaking your mind and speaking what you know to be truth. Also, one of the big reasons why we ended up where we did. I think the last thing I would say is don't embrace big government. Don't think it's good that the government will provide more and more and more of your needs. The enemy of the free people is a big government. More than that government's particular ideology. And, I've only fully realized that in the last 11 months of the lockdown now. A big right-wing government is just as dangerous as a big left-wing government, or a big government that doesn't fall into either of those.
100%.
Right? I don't care whether it's communism or Nazism or anything in between. It's the size of the government that is the ultimate evil. It's the ultimate enemy. Because anybody or any group of people that has too much power, too much control, too much money, they can and they will likely do terrible, evil things. You can't escape that. That's human nature. We don't like to admit it or talk about it. That's the way it is. I've seen it happen the last 11 months. I've seen these health authorities and how in the beginning, they were a lot less arbitrary, a lot less capricious, a lot less imposing. What they were doing, the anti-lockdown people certainly thought was wrong and stupid, but they were, they're kind of doing it innocently, really. Now what I see is different, and I see this every day, and so I've watched the progression of it, and having a background in philosophy, I know a thing or two about human nature and history. I've seen it happen before. I'm watching it unfold. I watch these health authorities and how much more capricious and controlling and oppressive they are. They can't help it because they're human, right? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? These health agencies, if they weren't already corrupt, have become more corrupt because they've been given too much power, right? But, Canadians and people in general are kind of their own worst enemies because we generally have embraced big government. We've embraced it as somehow good. We've embraced in Canada that public health care is a good thing. Well, is it? Like, we don't even ask the question anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Public health care means big government, and big government over healthcare. Well, that involves a lot of areas of your life. That involves your body, what goes into it, what you're allowed to put into it, what you're allowed to access for, what you're not allowed to access for it. Right? It's through public health that we are destroying livelihoods. We are destroying the economy. We are ravaging relationships. It's through public health that's come about, right? If the government wasn't so big, if our healthcare system wasn't so massive, wasn't so controlling, didn't have so much power, would this have even been possible, right? I mean, governments can only perpetuate grave evils on their own people or other people's if they have the power and the control to do so, right? So that's a big thing. People really need to evaluate whether or not big government is actually a good thing. I'm going to put it to people that it is actually the source of evil. 100 million people were murdered by governments in the 20th century, and they were all big governments, right? It was mostly communist governments, right? It was mostly communism with a little bit of Nazism, but the common feature there is that they were all big, right? The German Nazi government was big. It controlled everything, right? The Soviet Russian government, right? The Mao-led Chinese government, they controlled everything, right? One of the defining features of the Western democracies is what we call a limited government. Well, it's not a coincidence that now in the Western nations, the so-called free nations, governments are no longer limited, and they've been growing for decades, and now we've reached that point where they're the furthest thing from limited. And what's happened? Now they're harming their own people.
Yeah.
It's inevitable, actually. It's history repeating itself is what it is, right? So if we in this lifetime want to escape this and not have it again, we have to embrace limited government, right? That's what the Americans, or I guess if you want to call them the British, were doing in the 1600s when they fled Britain to the New World. That's what they were doing. They were fleeing the tyranny of a big, powerful, oppressive British government, and they founded what is arguably the freest nation that has ever existed in the history of humanity, right? That's what has to happen again if we're going to be free.
I agree with you. I agree. James, thank you so much. And what about the new frontier? Do we see some things do we see a sea change at all? Are you starting to see, I know for my own self, not having been involved until recently, really, I guess the last month and a half, I see a groundswell of people that are wanting to get involved. And is that what you're seeing as well, or?
I am, and I'm thankful for that. And I hope it's enough, but that hope is dim. I don't know that it is. I fear that it is too little too late, to be perfectly frank. We have a real problem now with millions upon millions of people that have no understanding or value of fundamental rights, human rights, of fundamental freedoms. I mean, in the legal world in Canada, they're called charter rights or constitutional rights. But I mean, if we drill even deeper, and we're just talking on a non-legal field that everybody can understand, it's fundamental. Most people can I think actually agree on a lot of these fundamental rights. Most people think I should have a right to have property and to decide what I do with it. I should have a right to believe whatever I want. I should have a right to not just believe it, but actually do something about it. If I want to wear something on my head, if I want to eat a certain thing, if I want to pray a certain way, if I want to gather a certain way, I should have the right to actually be able to say what I think. I should have the right to gather with other people. Most people can they don't often think about or articulate them, but if they did, they'd probably find quite a bit of common ground and agreement, despite cultural or other differences, right?
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, we have millions of people that have placed such a low value on that. They've prioritized other sort of imaginary rights or unattainable rights, like the right to safety, the right to never be infected with an infection, the right to make other people shut up when they don't like what they say, the right to put somebody else in jail because you have an irrational fear of an infection. These are not rights, nor could they ever be, and still have a free society, right? So I foresee a real problem with trying to reach these millions of people that place almost no value on their own fundamental rights and on the fundamental rights of everybody else around them, right? People place no value on other people's rights anymore, right? And I mean, I'm a libertarian, so I'm the last thing from a collectivist, right? But the reason I value and want to protect and want to honor other people's fundamental freedoms and human rights is because that's the only way that mine can be, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, no man is an island, whether you like it or not. We're stuck living with each other.
Yeah.
Well, so we need to actually look out for other people's rights, and in a sense, that's also, call it selfishness or not, but you're doing that to protect your own,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, me and other people who want to live free are going to be dragged down by all those who don't want to, right? Because we're stuck. We live in the same, country or space or nation or land as they do, right? And it's that's the problem. You have politicians and journalists and business leaders and regular Joes, and they don't value their own freedom and they don't value other people's, and to try and reach them and tell them, what, actually your freedom is not only real and attainable, but it's unlike the right to safety, which is unreachable and elusive. They're actually more important, right? I mean, is it really a better life to live free, but supposedly, to live as a slave and supposedly safe, or free and have a little more risk,
mm-hmm.
right? That's the reality of life on Earth, is that it's very risky. It's often lethal, and it often hurts. We can't escape that, right? Those 100 million people that died in the 20th century died because of a foolish attempt to achieve a utopia, whether it was a workers' paradise utopia or a racial purity utopia. They were all attempts to create a utopia. What did we get? We got a dystopia.
Yeah.
Right? Which is the opposite. Like North Korea is probably the best modern example of a dystopia, right? If anybody's read any dystopian novels, probably the most famous modern one would be the Hunger Games. That's a dystopia, right? We live in a dystopia right now, right? If you think about this, we don't see it for what it is because we've just gradually been dragged into it. But if I was to write a book about the world that we live in now, right, it would look just as dystopian as Brave New World in 1984 and Kafka's works, right? It would. That's what we're living in. because we tried to create a utopia of safety and health, and in the process we've created a dystopia where we don't have any freedoms. That's exactly what happened in the 20th century in those countries where 100 million people died, and history's repeating itself. If we as humans keep trying to create a utopia instead of a free society, we'll get the opposite of what we want, and we will be slaves.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly feel like I've been slaved in the last year. It's been brutal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I've seen. It's what I've seen and heard.
I agree with you. Is there a call to action? Is there anything we can do?
Well, I mean, people need to peacefully fight back. You will not get your freedoms back on their own if you do nothing.
Yeah.
The public health crisis, COVID, the lockdowns, the mask, none of it will end until enough people say it needs to end. It will not end on its own, right? It was 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Now it's damn near a year to flatten our liberties.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to any historian or philosopher or somebody like me who studied those things in depth, that's entirely predictable. It's not surprising at all.
Yeah.
I knew what was going to happen in March. I was dismayed at what I saw because I knew it wasn't 2 weeks. I knew, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, back in March of 2020, that is, to say, this is a government takeover, well, that was labeled as a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it sure
instead
was.
of labeled as sober perspective from the viewpoint of history, it was labeled conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Right. It was part of the reason why it was so easy to get away with it. Right. Sure. None of this surprises me, dismays me, but it doesn't surprise me. Right. So if we're going to get out of it, people have to, enough people are going to have to do something about it. They're going to have to stop being so scared. They're going to have to take the risk and speak up. They're going to have to stop being so scared of losing their job.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to have to be so stop being so scared of losing access to something.
Yeah.
Of losing friends or whatever it is. Right. I mean, because if you're so scared of losing those things that you won't do anything, then you're actually a slave to them.
That's right.
Right. If you're scared to give up Costco, well, then you're a slave to it.
That's right.
I've had to give it up. I don't wear a mask.
Yeah.
Right. It violates my conscience. Right. But I'm not going to get into a fight with somebody about it. That's not going to help anything. So I've given it up. And I've given up plenty of other things.
Understand.
Right? So, but you're going to give up a lot more in your job in the long run. There is a point of no return.
Yeah, there is.
Right. There is a point where no matter how many people stand up and do something, it'll be too late.
Yeah.
We're not, historically speaking, we're not that far from that point.
I agree.
So if we want to get out of this, if we don't want to live in a modern communist state, then we got to do something about it now, peacefully, but we got to do something about it.
I agree.
Right. So that's my call to action. And there's other people doing it. It's not, there's people waiting for the people who are on the fence and can't decide if they're there's other people doing something, taking the risk, taking action. And they're waiting to accept you and count you part of the team and to, keep pushing forward. Right.
I agree.
There's business owners and there's lawyers and there's activists and there's, businessmen and there's academics, there's doctors, there's scientists, there's people that are already doing it. So the other people who are on the fence just need to say, yep, count me in too.
I agree. I've joined the End Alberta Lockdown movement, certainly trying to support the businesses that are staying open and certainly going to keep helping Will and his wife and that great team. Is there any other groups that are something that we can join or sign up for or give money to?
Well, of course, everybody should be getting the newsletter from the Justice Center, of course. And if they have the means, they should be donating too, right? Yeah. It's the Justice Center is a nonprofit charity. We're like a public interest law firm, right? But all of our services are offered pro bono to our clients, right? we can only do what we do because we get enough donations to pay the salaries of the people who do this stuff, right? That's how I'm paid, is by salary, right? From donations. So the more donations, the more staff, the more cases, the more cases, and advice and representation, then the more able we are to defend the free society, right? And so if people have the means, yeah, and you know, and I mean, there's obviously other organizations. We're not the only ones. You know, we probably take the fight on the legal front more than anywhere else, and we you know, we know what we're doing in that area. But there's other fronts to battle on too, and you know, so I'm not saying to support the Just Center exclusively, but if you have the means, add them in.
For sure.
You know, to who else? And I mean, as far as who else to be aware of and support, I don't specifically know. You know, I mean, there's, you know, if you get connected to guys like Randy Hillier and these few politicians that are doing things, I mean, I'm sure they can put you in touch with people. It depends on where you are, right? If you're in Alberta, then it's the end of the lockdown. If you're in Ontario, then it's, you know, it's Randy Hillier and his guys over there. So I guess it depends a lot on where you are, but it doesn't take long if you do some digging to find the advocacy groups and potentially the political parties or even individual politicians that you can support, right? I mean, it's, you know, I mean, everybody should be aware that there is a politician in Alberta that somewhat opposes lockdowns. His name is Drew Barnes, right? You don't need to be his constituent to let him know, like, hey, I support you. I'm glad you're doing this. I think you should keep going. I think you should do more. I think you should do this. Maybe I'll send a little bit of money to your campaign office, right?
Exactly.
You know, it's the same thing with Randy Hillier in Ontario, right? You know, the Wild Rose Independence Party in Alberta opposes the lockdowns.
Yeah.
You know, that's so.
I agree. James, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your expert opinions and perspective, and thank you for fighting the good fight for all of us. I really appreciate you.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, James. Everyone, that was James Kitchen. Check out the great work that they're doing. Get on their newsletter, send some money. We all need to keep doing this great work and support the politicians that are on our side. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for joining us on Cats Track.